Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everybody, and thanks for listening. I'm here today with Amy Boucher, who is the host of the podcast Shropshire Witches podcast. She also writes the blog Nearly Knowledgeable. She had an audio drama called The Best of Men that's out there for you to find. And we are going to talk today about Shropshire folklore and Amy's personal folklore. And Amy is graciously here with me. I'm trying a new thing because folkloring is for everybody. And so I want to explore how people experience folklore in their day-to-day life besides me. And so she agreed to come on the show and talk about it. And I think that we are going to have a lot of fun. So welcome, Amy. Thank you for being here.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk a little bit about my folklore.
But before we do that, let's talk about folkloring. How have you been folkloring lately?
So I want to preface this by telling you I'm not very crafty at all. I'm a bit useless at it, to be honest. But there's a traditional kind of, it's all over Britain, but it certainly was quite prominent in the 1900s in Shropshire, practice of making rag rugs. So you'd take little snippets of rags and you'd get a big hessian sack, and using a clothes peg, an old wooden clothes peg, you'd sew it in a way, well, it doesn't actually have any sewing in it, but you'd thread it in a way that it makes a big rag rug. And my grandmother was meant to be very, very good at making these rag rugs. So I decided very, very recently to try and be a bit more like my grandmother and try and do it myself. So there are more modern ways to do it now, and you can make quite modern patterns. And I saw one on, I think it was Pinterest, that was the pattern of a skull and crossbones, but I don't want that. I want it to be very traditional, and I've started trying to make rag rugs, and I'm a bit useless at it at the moment. I'm all fingers and thumbs, but it's the really nice thing to do because it feels very much like I'm connecting to my grandmother and to that tradition of,
Sure.
Sitting by the fire and trying to make your house a little bit brighter. So I've found my brightest kind of shreds of cloth, like reds and blues and things, and hopefully soon I'll be a bit better at it.
Yeah, I remember doing that in the 70s when I was a kid.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
Like at camp, we would do that. But there were no patterns. I mean, it was all just sort of random strips of t-shirts that we had cut up. But yeah, that was a huge thing. And it always would go in the kitchen in front of the sink. Yeah, good memory.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. It's nice to see it's crossed over and it's not just left in Shropshire, but hopefully I'll have a semi-decent rug by maybe this time next year with the rate I'm doing it. It's very slow and steady.
Now, as for me, I just planted my garden for the year. It's spring when we're recording this, 2 days ago. And I was out in the yard. It was very hot, but I got it all done just in time, or just ahead of the dust storm that we had in Chicago 2 days ago.
Oh, wow.
And it was only the second time it's happened in recorded history, and it's not happened in my life. And it was shocking, and I was getting these alerts on my phone, and I was like, what the heck? And I like my windows open, as my listeners will know. I'm weird like that. But yeah, it was like all of a sudden everything filled with dust, and in some parts it was like zero visibility. So
oh wow.
Yeah, happily I got my garden done before that, but then I had to go like wash everything down. Because it was freaky. It was like nothing I've ever seen. It still kind of hurts to breathe a little bit.
Yeah.
Like I was choking when it was going on. It was so bad. But anyway, it's all done now. My garden is planted. My raspberries are in. All of my herbs.
Oh, that's great.
And I do herbs every year because I've got lots of big planter boxes on my deck. And I'm to the point now where I'm like, maybe I should start giving out herb bundles for Christmas because
that's cool.
Yeah, I've got a lot. So anyway, okay, let's get into it. Let's talk about you and your folklore, your family lore, the lore of the land where you grew up. So just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how it is that you connect to folklore.
Yeah, okay. So my name, as I don't know why I'm telling my name again, I'm Amy, but there you go. And I feel very blessed to have grown up in the area that I have grown up and that I've now returned back to, and that's Shropshire. So I grew up in a place called Telford and Wrekin, which I think for many people in England has a bit of a stereotype of being maybe not very nice, or a town, or it was a modern town that they built in the 1960s. But in reality, they built the town around some very, very old villages, to the point where some of them are actually mentioned in the Doomsday Book. So there is a lot of history in my locality. There's a lot of history in Shropshire as well, in the wider area. So I feel very, very lucky to have experienced that. I am a writer and folklorist, and a lot of my work, all of my work centers around Shropshire. It's very rare that I leave the boundaries of the county, and even then, it's rather reluctantly. And I kind of look at the interplay between history and folklore, because I believe that folklore is important cultural phenomenon, but also it is a powerful tool for the historian.
Right.
Now, that's not necessarily to say that we should believe everything as verbatim in folklore, because obviously, that's not the case. Some of these stories are fictional, and they're fictional for a reason, but they can provide us with an insight into the community they belong to. And by unpicking them and looking at the threads of the story and the implications of the story, I think we can get a very unique insight into the culture, or the particular group that shared these stories. And in particular, I think working class narratives that so often are left out of history, or they are stereotyped in history. So a lot of my work is looking at stories and their historical implications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as a folklorist, I feel like it doesn't matter whether stories are true or not.
Yes, yeah.
It's like maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but
Yeah.
it's why do people believe the things that they believe, and what is important about the stories, the way that they're told specifically, how they change from region to region, as you were saying. So yeah, I mean, folklore it's neutral, right? The stories are what is important when you're studying it. So I hear that.
Yeah, and I think so. I do a lot of ghost lore and work around historical ghost narratives, and quite often I get asked, "Oh, so do you believe in ghosts, or have you ever had any experiences with ghosts?" And that's a separate thing. I've had probably experiences you could call paranormal experiences, but I don't think as a folklorist it matters. I don't think it matters whether ghosts exist. I personally am more inclined to believe they do, but these stories can tell us so much about the culture and the group and the region and everything, really intricate, interesting insights into the particular community. And I think that's really where my interest lies, is looking at the story, or looking at the written down versions of the story, because so much of Shropshire's folklore had a history as in the oral tradition, but then it was written around the 1800s,
Mm-hmm.
finally written down, and unpicking what it must have meant to that community. And I think I really like what you said about folklore being neutral, because it is, and it's also very fluid. So these same stories that I know my kind of ancestors were telling, or would have told, they have a very different meaning to me now, though I still tell the same stories. And I think folklore in that regard can connect us to our families, our family history, and also our sense of identity and place. So I think folklore is so much more than just, superstitious stories or what have you. I think it's such a powerful thing that I feel very lucky to be able to delve so much into and to dedicate so much time into looking at.
Absolutely. Now, you were telling me earlier that you grew up in the Shropshire area, which you said, and now you're back there. after being away for some time. And
Yeah.
so it must feel so good to reconnect with the land that the stories of your youth owns, right?
Oh, definitely. So when I started my blog, it was during lockdown in the UK. So it was in the 2020 lockdown. I was working in quite a high intensity job. I was working in a homeless shelter. I was incredibly stressed. I was feeling my own kind of mental health issues with regard to the pandemic and things that had happened previously. So my blog was started in a purely selfish way to try and reclaim myself and to reclaim a little bit about me and to explore where I had come from and to just share the stories that I liked. And I remember saying to my partner that if 10 people read it, I'd be happy because it was a way in which I could look at home. So I think now that I'm back, I've been back for nearly a year now, finally settled after a bit of uncertainty with housing. I feel so connected to the place that I was missing and was longing for so long. And it makes me think of there's a writer called Mary Webb who wrote in Shropshire and wrote Gone to Earth and Precious Bane and a few other books centered around the area. And she says that when she's talking about Shropshire, that there's a continuity that makes the passing of centuries feel like moments.
Mhm.
And I really agree with that. It's the fact that I've been gone for 10 years other than for visits, but it feels the same and the landscape is still the same and there's little differences and things, but that love of the area hasn't waned
Mhm.
from me moving back. It's anything, it's got more intense and more special, and it's particularly because a lot of my like I have no more grandparents left, they've all passed, and a lot of my family are getting quite old, that I'm able to kind of take a trip down my own memories and my own, I suppose, folklore and things, and remember them through where I am, rather than just remembering them far from where I am. So it's special, and particularly I grew up being told, so there's a hill in Shropshire called the Wrekin, and it's very special to people in my particular area, in the Telford Wrekin area, because it has so much folklore. It's a beautiful walk. It's an old hill fort as well. But I'm now actually, from my living room window, I can see it.
Oh, wow.
It's almost like I have come full circle. So I feel very lucky to be back.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in the idea of land spirits and how,
Yes.
each area, and again, doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is like maybe it's just the way that the landscape looks. Maybe it's the way that the people are and treat each other and the feel of that particular area and the weather and everything. Or maybe it is land spirits that you connect to. We forget, especially people who have moved away from where they grew up, you forget how connected you can feel to a particular place. Obviously, there are people who don't, who, they've had a bad experience or they were bullied and they don't want to go back and relive those memories. And that's a shame. But when you do have good memories and, of the place and you can go back there, that's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think people, because I too, I think there's land spirits and there's a spirit of place, and that you can connect into that. And some places I think you can connect deeper than other places. So you might go somewhere and think, oh, this is lovely, but you won't necessarily connect
Mhm.
on that deeper level. Whereas some places you go and you just feel almost as if that you've got roots and they're shooting down into the earth, and that you are connecting with that vibe. And it could be just the atmosphere, the landscape, what have you, but I'm inclined to believe in kind of the idea of it being the spirit of place.
Mhm.
And I think you can find that anywhere. It doesn't have to be your hometown, it doesn't have to be the county you grew up in. You can go somewhere and suddenly feel very connected. So, for example, I've got friends who born and raised within the 5 mile radius to where I grew up. They have no connection to Shropshire, no connection to the Telford and Wrekin area, but one of them loves the Highlands of Scotland, and he's moved up to the Highlands of Scotland. He feels very, very connected to the area. He describes the Highlands of Scotland in exactly the same way I describe Shropshire.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we find our special place, or the place that we're meant to be. And I think sometimes that might just be where you're from. And I feel very lucky to have that here, because there's so much history, there's so much heritage, there's so much folklore, ghost lore, and also so much of my own family story
Mm-hmm.
is connected to this county. So I'm really interested in ancestry. I'm part of my kind of spiritual beliefs. I are involved with ancestor veneration and that kind of thing. But I also, on a historical level, like looking into my family story. And on my mother's side, I've looked into her family tree, and I've got back to the early 1700s, and no one has left Shropshire.
Wow.
So I think my connection to the area is because I love it and because of the stories and what have you, but also that's a very, very long legacy in this county, and a very, I suppose, very big boots to fill to carry Shropshire's stories, because so much of their history is within either the agrarian in this area or the mining heritage when you get a little bit later. So yeah, they didn't like to move, my mum's side of the family.
It's so interesting because, as an American, right, there's like all of us are, imports at some
Yeah.
point. And my mom's family came from Scotland, and
Yeah.
my dad's family came from Greece. And I will say, I feel very connected to the land here where I live, but I think, about as connected as I've ever felt anywhere when I was in Greece.
Yeah.
And it was just like, this is home, right? And so it was interesting. I have not yet been to Scotland. I really want to go to Scotland. So like for me, my parents weren't super connected to the land either, because when I was just after I was born, my parents met and were living up in Milwaukee. And then my dad
Mm.
got a job with the state of Illinois. So they had to move to Illinois. And so they weren't where I grew up, they weren't connected to the land there. So it was sort of like developed from just growing up there and running around in ravines and
Yeah.
hanging out in the woods and all of that. So yeah, there's no sort of legacy for me. I mean, I can look back to the records at Ellis Island and see where, like, when my great grandfather came here and signed in and moved to Ohio. And I've got a family tree of my mom's family, and I think it goes back 7 generations.
Mm.
So yeah, it's all very interesting, but it's not like this land, right? And like I
Yeah.
have their stories. It's cool to have that kind of history.
Yeah, I feel very lucky. I think I do like to think what the ancestors would have thought of me moving to Lancashire, because I went to university in Lancashire, which isn't that far certainly by American standards. It's probably within the same wider area because America's massive, but it's about 100 miles away where my university was. And I think they would have probably been quite panicked because so little of them had actually left the county, or when they did leave the county, it was for very, very short bursts. So it must have been a bit like, whoa, what are you doing? kind of thing. But I do feel, and I think there's just so much here that ties to my personal interests. So the history in Shropshire, we've got an awful lot of like castles, medieval history, because traditionally Shropshire was a border county. So during the wars with the Welsh, if you wanted to get into England, you would probably go through Shropshire. So it was key for defence. And really, for a lot of the medieval period, the power that the Marcher Lords, Shropshire, Herefordshire, Chester, that kind of area had was independent to the king. So yes, the king was the king, but if you really wanted to, you could make a little deal with the Welsh and let everybody in and cause a bit of a stink in England. So there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of industrial history that my family have a lot of kind of participation in. So a lot of the industry, because the Industrial Revolution is argued to really have started in the Iron Bridge Gorge, because that was where the first bridge made of iron was built, and a lot of the techniques that were perfected through building that bridge were then imported all over the world. A lot of my family were directly involved with the industries that helped build the bridge and stuff. So I think I just look at the landscape and I see such a sense of place and such a sense of my own heritage and my own ancestors. And then that's only accentuated through folklore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. Like when I tell people, "Oh, my house was built in 1897," right? And they're like, "Oh my God, like it's ancient." And I'm just thinking, no, no, it isn't. It's old enough to be a big pain and always need something fixed, but it is
Yes.
not ancient. Okay, so let's talk about some of the folklore that you learned growing up, or maybe some of your family folklore.
Yes, so I want to start with really my introduction to folklore. So I didn't really know what folklore was when I was a child, but I knew stories that I would now look at and go, oh, yeah, that's folklore, because so much of it was still shared with us and told and kind of explored through different, I suppose, really oral histories. Now, that really centered in my family around my grandfather. So my grandfather was, well, he'd be nearly 100 if he was alive now. So he kept having children and he had them into his 40s, and that was my mum. Um, so he was very much, even though he wasn't born in the Victorian period, really he was a product of Victorian parents. He was very traditional, and a lot of his stories actually you can see in Victorian publications and that kind of thing. And he wasn't a professional storyteller by any stretch of the imagination, but he had a bit of a knack for telling stories. And a lot of them were what we would now look at and go, yeah, no, that's almost a carbon copy of the folk tale. So, for instance, the story of the Wrekin Giant, he used to get very animated when he told that tale. And it's basically, there's lots of different variations of the Wrekin Giant story, but the Wrekin was said to have been put there by a very, very angry giant. So one day, this giant, he was up in the Welsh hills and he had a bit of a headache, and he kept hearing this loud, incessant noise coming from Shropshire.
Mhm.
And he hated Shropshire because Shropshire was full of good Protestants who were rather noisy, but still were very dedicated to their God and dedicated to their religion. And the noise got louder and louder, and he investigated and he saw it was Shrewsbury. So the tale goes on about how he's trying to find ways that he can finally rid himself of the noise and rid himself of Shrewsbury. And he decides to take a big clod of earth with his spade, walk all the way to Shrewsbury and flood the River Severn. Solves the problem. The River Severn is always flooding, so it wouldn't even be that they could point the finger at the giant, because it's always flooding. It floods at least 3 times a year. So the giant would be in the clear. No jury could prosecute him. So he goes, but he's a little bit stupid, this giant, Gwendol. Ap Wrekin ap Shenkin Minmauer, his name is, which is a mouthful, and certainly not something I'd want to repeat after a few drinks. And he's got this clod of earth on his spade and he's walking, but he gets very confused. The sun's very warm. He's not entirely familiar with the route and he gets lost. So we're told that he bumps into a cobbler who's carrying a big sack of shoes, and the shoes are all worn out.
Mm-hmm.
The cobbler notices a giant and thinks, oh dear, because that's not something you'd usually see. Even in Shropshire, it's a bit rare. And he realizes he has to come up with quite a cunning plan. So the giant, to paraphrase the story a little bit, tells the cobbler that he's going to Shrewsbury to dam the River Severn. But the cobbler, a lot of his trade actually comes from Shrewsbury. So it doesn't want it to be flooded because then he'd be out of business.
Right.
So he spins the yarn and he says, well, actually, I've been walking since I was a young man, but look at me now. I'm old, I'm stooped. I've got this big bag of shoes. When I started walking, these were all clean, fresh shoes, but I've walked so far that I've walked holes into them all, and I'm still no closer to Shrewsbury. So the giant has an absolute meltdown about it all, throws his spade, and the earth forms what we now call the Wrekin. There's a hill, And this story, I think, is cut into the absolute veins of people who are blessed to grow up around the Wrekin. We're all told it, we're all shared it. And my granddad used to tell me that story quite a lot. And he used to get very animated when he described it, and he'd put on all the voices. So that was really my first proper introduction to folklore in the traditional sense. And it came from my grandfather. But then the other story he used to tell was from his own experiences, we're told. I say we're told because I'd like to suspend a little bit of disbelief.
Sure.
And apparently, when my granddad was a boy, he met the devil.
Oh.
Yeah, so I've told this story a lot of times, but it really was, again, my introduction to folklore. And I see it now as part of really my family's own personal folklore, and certainly probably the reason why I turned out like I did as well. And apparently, when my granddad was a boy, he grew up in the Ironbridge Gorge, where we were just talking about with the Industrial Revolution. And he really did not like going to church. He didn't like going to church because the vicar droned on, apparently. And also, after church, his mum would gossip and talk with the local ladies, and it would make an hour out of his day, more like 3 hours. So he hated it. And one day he said that he was feeling particularly crafty, and he wanted to come up with his own way out of it. So he talked to some more local boys and his cousin, and he said, you know what, we're not going next week, we're not going to do it, we're not going to church, we're going to sneak away. And the boys would feel a bit less kind of brave than my granddad, and they said, well, what can we do, they'll miss us. And he said, no, we're going to do it, we're going to sneak away and we're going to play some games, we're going to enjoy ourselves.
All right.
Fair play. So he came up with this plan, and basically, as the people were going into church, he entered church, then snuck out through the other door. So a lot of doors in churches, they have like a side door which often was called the devil's door, actually. So he snuck out, and the church is St. Luke's Church in Ironbridge, and there's about 109 steps up because it's cut into the gorge, and there's a little covered area. So they snuck away down the steps and they started to play cards. And they were playing blackjack and what have you, and other games. When all of a sudden it got really cold, my granddad said, and he felt a cold hand with long nails on his shoulder.
Oh.
And then he turned around, and rather annoyingly, obviously he didn't realise I was going to be a folklorist. He never described the devil, so I have no idea what the devil looked like. But he did say that he locked eyes with the devil, and that the devil told him in no uncertain terms that if he wasn't to stop what he was doing and he was going to continue down that path, he would be seeing a lot more of him, and eventually he'd end up with him. And apparently this scared my grandfather right the way back into the church, and he wouldn't let anybody play cards or do anything like that on a Sunday ever again. And interestingly, other than the fact that that is as tall of a tale as you can probably get, there is a lot of devil folklore within Shropshire, and this folklore mirrors my grandfather's story. So now, as a folklorist and not a child scared stiff, I can see where he's picked little pieces from. So, for example, in Shropshire folklore, the devil is often a moralizer, which you don't necessarily expect always, because you have more of a Judeo-Christian religious idea of the devil. But often in Shropshire's folklore, the devil is actually saying, look, pack it in. If you don't stop, you're going to end up seeing me a lot more, and working as a moralizer. So he's nicked that from some stories. The devil, I think, just in folklore cross-culturally likes card games. So he's nicked that from other places. And there is associations with the devil and the Industrial Revolution because the landscape mirrored hell. So naturally, they, through the fire of the kilns and the blast furnaces, started to tell stories about there being a devil there. So I love that tale because not only is it a little piece of him, he's been gone now since, it's got to be over 10 years. And my grandfather had quite a lot of dementia prior to him passing. So we lost him before we really lost him.
Right.
So I see this story now as a very pertinent symbol of him. And I tell it because I love it, but I also tell it because I'm very much a believer in that kind of Terry Pratchett idea that no one's gone while their name is still spoken. So by telling that story, I'm able to honor him and allow a little bit of his kind of more devilish side with his tall tales to continue and to live on. And I see it very much as my connection with the landscape as well, and my connection particularly with the Ironbridge Gorge, where so much of my family really had quite difficult lives in that gorge because of the Industrial Revolution.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
And I know how you feel, because my dad had dementia as well.
Mm.
And to like lose them little pieces at a time it's harder, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you don't know who you're getting. So it's nice that you were able to retain that story and have that personal piece of folklore to connect to, someone who has gone before. And I think that it's really cool to be able to, as a grown-up, go back and start saying, hey, I see these pieces of this story here, and I see another piece of the story there, and sort of and that's how stories develop, right? I mean, they were an oral tradition forever, and so they change depending on exactly where they are. And you got even a more specialized version of a story because, knowing that the devil in the stories there is a moralizer. It's really interesting because usually you think of the devil as tempting, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And trying to get people to go astray. And it's like so unique that it's different there, and that your grandfather is able to take that idea and turn it into something that is like a scared straight kind of
Yeah. Yeah. It certainly worked with me. I wouldn't touch cards on a Sunday when I was younger.
Now, here's a question. Have you ever been to that particular church?
Yes. So it's still really probably the most local to where I grew up, other than one other church. And there is a bit of the church inside is nice and it's got a really nice atmosphere. But when you do go up the stairs, the 109 stairs, now it might be because they're steep and you're walking up the side of a gorge and you're out of breath. But there is a little bit of an eeriness to it. There is a bit of a feeling. So I do think perhaps he was playing on the fact that it's a bit creepy and developing it with his own flair. But certainly it's a beautiful church, and it's got its own unique history. It's relatively new for Shropshire's churches. So Shropshire's churches, a lot of them are Domesday Book or like 1100s, 1200s, and it's 1851. I think it was completed. So it's a very, very modern one by Shropshire standards. But you could imagine the devil turning up there, particularly in Ironbridge, because historically Ironbridge was very, very working class, and there was a lot of pubs and ale houses and drinking. There was just up the road in Madeley Wood, a vicar called John Fletcher took parish there. And apparently the locals decided to, rather than play bull baiting, they decided to bait the parson and try and pet dogs on him because they didn't like him being there. So it was a bit rough around the edges in the 1800s. It would have been a bit rough around the edges in my grandfather's day. So you could imagine it being the sort of landscape the devil would come out to play.
Yeah, and I think that, when you start to look at these stories, a lot of them, like the devil's not going to show up in the middle of a big crowd, right?
No, no.
So when you have more kind of space and land around you, the devil's going to, like he did with your grandfather, sneak up on you, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's just easier to have those kinds of stories. And it makes me think back to like even alien stories. It was always like out on some country road and
Yeah.
the car dies. Although I have been hearing lately of some alien stories. There was that poor woman on a plane who was saying that like one person was an alien. And then there was another person on a train who was saying everybody was aliens. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, I think it's pretty interesting because, before, what was dangerous to people was being out in the dark, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and there were animals out there that would kill you. And the safety came in gathering together. And I think now as we start to look at what our current lives look like, there's so much of people othering other people.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's like the devil's amongst us now because we don't trust. There's no more safety in numbers because we've been told don't trust other people, don't trust these kind of people, don't trust those kind of people. And so I think that that's why we're starting to see a rise in those urban stories of things that were traditionally off in the countryside.
yeah. No, I agree with you there. And I think that's a really interesting perspective because I think we have become very isolated. I think even things like, we all use social media. It's a great platform for things like folklore, and there's an amazing folklore community on it. But it's, as a teacher, take away my folklore hat, but as a teacher, it's meant to be a social media, but if anything, it's an anti-social media because the way I see young people who I teach and interact with through my job using social media is incredibly harmful.
Yeah.
So I think we have created almost a digital space where we can connect to anyone all over the world, but we're not connecting with ourselves. We're not connecting on any real level. So I think it can be very harmful, and that explains why there is a rise in things. The devil's took on a new guise, he's aliens, or he's this, that, and the other. And certainly I think that's really interesting to look at it like that.
Yeah, I mean, I find that I'm on very little social media now, except for Blue Sky,
Yeah.
which I like. I did have the other day some random stranger came onto one of my posts and just started telling me how arrogant and self-aggrandizing I was for the number of hashtags I put on it. And I was just like, the mystery to me is why you feel like you can come onto my post and insult me as a random stranger. Like,
Yeah.
what's that about? And then I
Yeah.
was like, wait a minute, this is Blue Sky. So I blocked him. And I was just like,
Yeah.
don't fight with strangers on the internet. Just don't do it.
No, there's no, yeah.
Yeah, no point in it. So, but I agree, it is isolating. And, it's one of the reasons that it's nice to get out in nature and to, be able to connect that way because I'm an animist. And so it's like being able to connect with the life around me is important. And you don't do that on the computer.
No, I completely agree. I'm animist too, which is really cool that because you're the only person I've met that's
Oh,
that like that. That's yeah. And I think that is so important because I've always said, because I've been all over with my spiritual path. I've always known that I am spiritual. I always have known that it is more in that kind of pagan vein than anything else. I did have 6 weeks at primary school where I thought I was a Christian, which was uh, an interesting career arc. But yeah, but I've always kind of felt the way I've always described it prior to really embracing animism is that whatever my religious practice is, it is rooted in Shropshire because I feel the most connected. I feel the most attached to it. I feel the most spiritual when I am here. So before I knew the language for it, I'd be like, well, yes, I believe in this. I believe that there's a higher being that is connected through nature. And it's not quite paganism. It's not quite witchcraft. It's not quite Wicca, but I knew it was in that same kind of vein. But I knew it was rooted in Shropshire. I knew it was rooted in the landscape. It was rooted in those places and familiar places and the woodlands and the fields and the reeking and things like that. But then through really embracing animism and embracing ancestor veneration as well and looking into my ancestor stories, I was able to really articulate my own beliefs and why they all are so linked to the area, because it's natural if my family have never left the area that my connection to it is going to be through that. And I think I'm still very much, I always like using the phrase in the broom cupboard about my spirituality because I keep it very under wraps. I don't think it necessarily needs to be part of my folkloric practice, but then in the same sense, it's so linked to it. So I see folklore really as indicative to my spiritualism, and that's not because I believe the stories are religious stories or anything like that, but it's because they link so much to my ancestors, to their stories, to my belief to that higher power that I believe it in, and the nature and the land spirits and stuff. So I do really believe that through coming back to Shropshire, it's really enhanced that and enhanced that side of me.
Right.
So I don't feel like I need to be scrolling or doing that, because I can just get out and be, and it's such a good feeling.
Yeah, I heard a really interesting comment once, and it was from a minister that I knew.
Mm,
And he was talking about the Bible and whether the Bible, like whether the stories were real in the Bible.
mm,
And what he said was, I think the thing that most people don't really appreciate is that there's a difference between facts and truth. And there is truth in the Bible. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those are factual retellings of things that happened. It doesn't matter at all, because what you're supposed to get out of those stories is the underlying truth in them.
yeah.
And I always thought that was a really interesting way to look at it. And people do kind of mix those up. And they say, well, if it's the truth, it happened. No, there's a truth in the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I always have carried that with me and thought that was a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, no, I think that is, because I think that's something, because I teach religious studies, and one thing that students really confuse is that idea of truth and fact. So it's not fact, so therefore it must be false. But
Right.
then so like I've got a class with a lot of Christians in there, and we were doing about Jesus and the resurrection and all that kind of thing. And some of the students that weren't Christian were really not grasping it and really not getting their head around the idea, because it's not fact, because they can't prove it. Well, where was his body? All this kind of thing. And a Christian student actually articulated it in a very similar way, is that for them, it's the truth, and it doesn't matter whether it happened or not, because they'd rather have that truth than live a life without it. And I think that's, to look at my own path and my own practice, that's something that I've come to realize, is that it doesn't have to be an all singing, all dancing, look at me, I need a label for it.
Right.
It's, this is me, this is my identity, this is just part of me. And I think through my own exploration of folklore, I've been able to enhance that, because so much of I really do invite the ancestors into my life. I try and talk to them as much as possible, and I try and not in public, because I'd probably get a few eyebrows raised even in Shropshire, but I try and have an open space for the ones I want to be there and that are going to enhance my life. And as a whole, ancestors aren't going to come into your life unless they have something good, I believe. And I think through having that openness and allowing them to connect with me, I've really developed in myself, I've developed in my confidence. And so much of that as well comes from the folklore. So most of my ancestors, due to the sort of lives they lived, due to the world in which they inhabited, they were very working class, or at the lower end of working class, and they had quite difficult lives. They worked very hard. They subsisted backbreaking jobs with quite almost traumatic environments. Some of them, particularly the ones that were miners or worked in heavy industry, they have been denied a voice. Historically, people like my ancestors are denied a voice traditionally. They've been denied a voice within my own family, because they had the sort of lives they lived, they didn't want to talk about it when they went home. So they didn't share those kind of stories with their children, and then it didn't filter on down. But even down to things like, they didn't really even have the money for pictures. So there's very, very few family photos prior to really my grandparents. I've got one of my great granddad, and that's about it. So these people who are so part of me, they've almost been erased because of circumstance. They've been erased through really their own poverty. And I see my folklore as a way to give them a voice again. So we know that a lot of the stories in Shropshire are from at least the early 1800s. They've probably had a lot longer of an oral tradition, but they were written down in the mid to late 1800s. These stories were the sort of stories that my family and people like my family would have been very familiar with. So by sharing the folk stories, I feel like I'm giving them a voice. I feel like I'm sharing their legacy. I'm inviting them into my life and showing their relevance, showing that they mattered. And a lot of the kind of deep dives I go into when I look at a person's story are working class people who lived lives like my ancestors, who are just as deserving as being remembered as my ancestors. So I see folklore as really, really part of my own personal spirituality, and it's allowing them a chance to be heard and people like them as well. And there's a song that is by a English musician called Mike West. He's a kind of still quite a up and coming musician. He's brilliant. He does a brilliant brand of like country and metal, and it's amazing music. Really big fan of Mike West, and he's got a song called No Grave, and it's the idea that you don't necessarily need to visit a grave in order to remember the dead. And there's a lyric where he says, "Where I go, I carry my dead with me." And that's how I feel, is that because I am educated, because I have a platform now through my folklore, I'm carrying the story of my dead with me. They're always with me. I look in the mirror and my ancestors are looking back at me because they are part of me physically. And I think that song really highlights my relationship with ancestors that is primarily brought through the folklore, because even down to some of the stories I tell about women ghosts, their stories are so linked to the women in my family who have been exploited or have had children very young or have had the shame of a patriarchal society enforced upon them. So I'm giving them a voice again, I hope. So it's something I'm very passionate about. And I feel like through the folklore, things are finally started to slot into space. And I go, oh yeah, this is what I believe. And this is my personal folklore, my personal beliefs and that kind of thing.
So do you think that, like, having grown up there and heard these stories that your ancestors would have been telling, do you think, I always think when things are written down, that becomes like the authority, that is the story. Have you heard different oral versions of some of the stories that you research? What does that look like?
Definitely. So I think there's a tendency to believe that the Victorians so there was a real craze from about the 1860s through to about the 1880s, certainly in Shropshire, but elsewhere in Britain and other parts of the world, of folklore collecting through things like the Folklore Society, who were brilliant. And in Shropshire, people like Charlotte Byrne, she was the first person to really make a big collection of folklore of the region. And that is often touted as the authority. If it's written down in Charlotte Byrne, it happened, it was believed, or it was said. But Charlotte, in A Sheaf of Gleanings, which is the Shropshire folklore book she wrote, quite often says that she only writes down the things that she deems relevant, that she deems acceptable folklore, that she can then connect to wider folklore from other countries. There's also a lot of cures for different illnesses and stuff that she says is too disgusting to mention, or I will not comment about. So you don't actually get the full picture with these. So I think certainly just because it's been written down doesn't mean it's the most valid form of the story. And the really good example is the story of the Wrekin, the one I shared previously. So the canon story, the one that's kind of seen as being the authority, is the idea of it being a giant who very angrily created the Wrekin. There are also other variations of the story, and there's a folklorist who, I think she's not with us any longer, but she was certainly active in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And she said that when she was collecting folklore in the region, she was getting new variations of the Wrekin giant story as late as 1975, 1976, because wherever she went, they told a slightly different tale. And some of the other versions include two giants that are quarreling, and then a raven comes and pecks one's eye out because he's on the side of the other giant, and then traps him in the hill. And then there's another version from about 1840 to 1860 we see written down that actually says it's not a giant, it's the devil that builds the Wrekin. So we see lots of variations in the story in the written accounts, but also the version that I tell or I choose to tell on a particular day might be very different to what I tell a year's time, because I add, whenever I'm telling the story, the vein of it is the same. There's a giant who creates the Wrekin through his own anger and silliness, but I can't say that every time I tell it, it's verbatim, it's the same as it was when I first told it. And I think that's the beauty of folk stories, is that I will tell a story in a very different way to someone else in the county that tells it. And that doesn't mean that my version is less than theirs or vice versa, because they were never meant to be monoliths. They were never meant to exist entirely in their own. And I think through exploring all the different versions, we can see how they represent the community that was telling it. So, for example, the ones that advocate for the devil story for the Wrekin, that is going to come from a very different community of a very different ideas about things to the giants. And there's lots of examples of that within ghost lore in Shropshire, of stories that in one regard she might have been a lady who ended her own life, or she might have been a woman who was violated, or she might have been a woman that had her life taken by a man. And it's each community is putting a spin on the same story to share a little bit of their own history, a little bit of their own concerns, and the attitudes of the community as well. So I certainly think there's a danger of seeing folklore like a monolith, and we should embrace its various different forms. And I sometimes get a little bit of flack because I will share a story and I will say, in Shropshire it says this, or in Shropshire that it's a belief this, and people will say, well, no, actually it's not just Shropshire, it's being told in Lancashire, or it's being told in Devon. And I fully accept that. It's just that my research looks at the Shropshire side of it. So, and there's not enough characters often on Blue Sky or something to be able to say in Shropshire and Devon and Lancashire and this. So I just focus on Shropshire. But certainly a lot of Shropshire stories aren't unique. They're found in various versions across the county, across the country, and into other areas as well. So I think that's what's so exciting about folklore, is because you have this common thread that you can then spin and weave your own tapestry with.
Yeah, I think that I'm thinking about this one particular story of there's a lot of stories about the church steeples, and if if they tilt for whatever, poor construction, or if they have a particular like shape to it, and there's stories about steeples that are twisted, that the devil would be sitting on them and something would make him turn suddenly, right? And I'm not gonna picture how the devil would be sitting on that, but
yeah, not worth it.
Yeah, but I ran across this one specific story about it. And what it was people in I don't remember the name of the towns, but it was people in a specific town. They were talking about a church like the next town over. And the story was that what happened was a bride came up to get married. And it was, a townsperson, right? And the devil finds out that she's a virgin, and the devil is so surprised that one of the women from this town is getting married as a virgin that he spins around to look at her. I think it's hilarious.
That's great. I love that. That's very, yeah, I can see that.
Yep. So anyway, what you were talking earlier about some different folk remedies. Do you do any folk medicine? Has any of that been passed down through your family?
So I look into it and I've researched it, and there's certain things that I've kind of worked into my own practice that I know were a Shropshire thing. So certain things like horseshoes in Shropshire are massive. Okay. Not literally, they're not huge. They're just a very, very prominent feature of Shropshire law, particularly protection and house protection. Now, in Shropshire, there's a lot of debate about which way you hang the horseshoe, because sometimes it's upside down to just dazzle the devil. In other ways, it's upright so the devil gets caught in it. But then there is quite a few references to say that it actually doesn't matter how you hang it in Shropshire, because it's the iron that is the potent thing, not the actual shape of the shoe. So, because iron is meant to have properties to ward away fairies and evil and the devil, as long as that horseshoe is made of iron, it will protect the house. So I have, through my research, finally bought myself a little horseshoe to then hang up to protect the house. And I like a lot of the kind of other things as well that are to do with house protection. I don't quite have a hearthstone, unfortunately, but I really want to do. So there's in Edgemond, the way you protect your household is drawing intricate patterns in oak leaf on your hearthstone to stop the devil coming down the chimney and witches. And there's other little things, little kind of particularly to do with oak trees and herbal tree remedies. So like, and plants as well. So this year, in Shropshire, it's said that snowdrops are unlucky to bring in the house unless you bring them in on Candlemas. So I actually did that this year. I brought some in on Candlemas, and so far, touch wood, there's no bad luck. So luckily I remembered what day it was and I didn't bring them in. But I think now that I'm more settled, because I've moved around a lot in the last year, I've not had space or time or the mental capacity. I think some days with how drained I've been to do little things. So I really want to get back and do some of the things that I know were recorded. Unfortunately, within my family, I think, again, because of the nature of the sort of lives a lot of them lived, there's not much written down or wasn't really shared with me. One thing I know that my grandmother used to do was she'd collect rainwater on a full moon, and then she'd wash her hair and her face with it. And she'd only ever wash her hair and her face with rainwater in order to kind of beautify the complexion and to help the hair grow. And I know that she definitely did that. So we haven't had much rain, luckily, which is quite uncharacteristic for Britain at the moment, because it's been very sunny. But I want to do that for the next full moon. So I want to collect some rainwater and see if it enhances these very tired bags and this tired teacher's face.
Well, hopefully it will.
Yeah, hopefully.
I've also heard you can just put out water under the full moon and then...
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
As if it's...
See if that helps. Anything.
How, you only get one full moon. Most months you only get one full moon. And what if it doesn't rain those 3 days?
Yeah. So anything to get rid of these bags, it'd be very good.
Okay. So any other favorite Shropshire folk tales or favorite family folklore?
So there's a story that I absolutely love. And I found out through researching my ancestors that so it's based in a church called St. Peter's in Easthope, which is a tiny little village on Wenlock Edge, which is this big, long kind of stretch of rock formation. And it's really scenic. If you was to imagine the British countryside, Wenlock Edge is it. It's just beautiful. And Easthope, I don't even think you can call it a village, because there is about 3 houses, a farm, and a church, and the story centered around there. And I found out fairly recently, that a good proportion of my family for about 100 years are buried in the actual churchyard. And it's really weird to think it, because when I first visited the churchyard, I thought how amazing it must have been to be buried there. I mean, I don't like to think about being buried, but as far as views go, it's a beautiful place to spend eternity. And the story is actually called The Burly Fighting Monks of Easthope.
Okay.
So apparently, there's a abbey called Wenlock Abbey, and it's just up the road from Easthope. And they owned all of the lands in the medieval period, and they would send monks to collect taxes, and the monks would go around, collect the taxes, take them back to the priory and the abbey, and pass them all over to the abbot. However, during kind of the height of the medieval period, there was two monks who entered. They didn't know each other in their civilian life, but they entered the monastery for very similar reasons. And they both had probably been too fond of drinking and women and dueling, that kind of thing. So they had to enter the monastery quite quickly to avoid getting captured by justice of the peace and all that kind of thing, because they were in a lot of trouble outside the monastery. And none of them were particularly religious, neither of them. And neither of them particularly took their vows that seriously. But they were quite charismatic chaps. So very quickly they gained the trust of the other monks and the abbot. I mean, they were quite well liked within the monastery. And eventually they get a job actually collecting the taxes. So they're sent out every month to go to the villages on Wenlock Edge to collect the taxes and take them back. Now, as I said, these men were quite fond of women and drink and other earthly pleasures, shall we say. So what they would do is they would go to each village, they'd tell the village the taxes had gone up, have a little bit of a grumble, let them have a grumble and go, oh, I know, yeah, the abbot's a tyrant, you know. They would collect the taxes. They would then give the taxes that they were actually worth to the abbot, and they'd keep the rest for themselves. They'd spend it all getting drink and on women and genuinely making a bit of a public nuisance of themselves. And they knew each other. They knew that they wouldn't rat each other out because they had a good thing going, but they didn't really like each other. And there was a bit of a rivalry between them. One wanted to be better than the other one, that kind of thing. So often they would fall out when they'd had a skinful, and they would descend into verbal arguments and often physical violence, and they'd have to be split up by strapping farm lads to keep them away from each other. And they do this for quite a while. And then one day they are making their rounds. They've been to Shipton and they've been to Presthope, and they go to East Hope to collect the taxes. Tell the guys again, you know, he's put the taxes up. I know, he's awful. Let's have the money now, please. Bleed the community dry. And they enjoy themselves in the alehouse. They're getting very, very drunk. They're enjoying themselves immensely. There's a woman on each arm kind of thing. But the money runs out and they end up probably taking it a bit too soon, and they're still wanting to have a good night. It's still early. So one of the monks has a shred of decency and he says, look, we can't really do it. The rest of the money is for the abbot. He'll kick up a fuss. He'll have a go at us if we don't bring it to him. Whereas the other monk says, oh, well, no, I just want to spend it all. I want to spend it. Let's get drunk. Let's enjoy ourselves. And they argue a little bit. And the less scrupulous one says, well, actually, we could just pretend that we've been robbed. We could say bandits robbed us. They're common in the area. Let's enjoy ourselves. And they're arguing and they're shouting and they start insulting each other. And eventually they break into physical violence, but so scary because they're called burly fighting monks for a reason. They were big boys. I always think of like World's Strongest Man or Mr. Universe in cassocks. That's how I like to think of it. And they start scrapping. They have a massive fight, but they tumble down the cellar stairs as they're fighting. Like I always think as well of like the old-fashioned cartoons where you just see a dust cloud and kind of fists coming out and how Biff Bop noises, and they fall down the stone stairs, hit their heads, they both die on impact. So the community thinks, oh dear, there's two dead monks here, what are we going to do? Right. Because it's going to look like we murdered the monks. Let's just bury them and pretend that nothing happened. So they bury the monks in East Hope Church. They're not unmarked graves because they've got two stone slabs with crosses on them, but there's no name or anything like that. And they think, we'll just pretend it never happened. We'll say they didn't come here. They were lost to the bandits. It's fine. But these monks don't rest easy. They are said every evening at dusk to rise from the grave in spectral form and beat the living daylights out of each other like they did in life. And so much so that there is a giant crack through both of their gravestones because they've pushed each other in the spirit world onto the graves and cracked it. And I've always loved this story because it's got everything. It's got monasteries, it's got burly men in it, it's got fighting. But I love it even more knowing that whilst those ghostly monks are fighting, my ancestors have a front row seat to it because they're buried opposite.
That's awesome. I love that.
So yeah, I love burly fighting monks. I'd love to see them. Apparently you can hear them more than you can see them, but some people have reported seeing monks having a bit of a scrap, which if you were going to see a ghost, I think that might be the best possible thing to see. I don't want to see, headless horsemen or anything like that. I want to see monks fighting.
Yeah, you'd think that their legs would get tangled up in those robes. You think that would be like the
Yeah,
most convenient kind of outfit to wear for fist fighting, but
literally.
okay. So where can people find you if they want to hear more about Shropshire or if they want to find your blog? Where can they get you?
So I'm on Blue Sky and Threads, and I don't really use Twitter anymore, but I am on there still because I've not worked out how to delete it yet. I'm not very good with technology, and I'm all on there all as Goblin Egg. So Goblin, but the O is a 0 egg. Or under Nearly Knowledgeable. You can search me through Nearly Knowledgeable. My blog is Nearly Knowledgeable History at blogspot.com. And I am one half of the Shropshire Witches podcast with my lovely co-host Alex Chitley-Utley, who is brilliant. She's amazing, and we do a lot of exploring British history, British folklore, and also Shropshire's linked to it there. So really, that's where you can find me on. Threads I'm probably most active on, and my blog and my podcast.
And then you also had that audio drama, Best of Men.
Yes. Yeah, my audio drama as well. That's on all streaming sites, so like Spotify and things like that. And it's The Best of Men. And there's two parts. There's part 1 and part 2. And that explores Shropshire's satanic folklore and what would happen if a paranormal investigating TV show happened upon the devil himself.
And it's fantastic. I will tell you all.
Thank you.
So thank you for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. Is there any final thoughts that you have for listeners?
I think for me, it's just the idea of the benefit in exploring folklore. Folklore is not just superstitious stories or, something that you can read and go, oh, that's cool. There is so much depth to it. And so much of the stories, so many of the stories are linked to something deeper. And I think you can gauge and understand your own meaning to these stories, and that might be different to someone else's, but I think it's to really emphasize the brilliance of folklore. And obviously I'm on a folklore podcast, but folklore really has enhanced my life, enhanced my worldview, and it's enabled me to find my own voice as well as to share my ancestors' voice. So yeah, more folklore, less negative things, more folklore, I think.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for listening. I appreciate it and hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, thank you for listening to Folkloring. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.